In this video we will explore feudal Japan, starting from the Kamakura period and ending at Edo period. If you enjoy these videos, please feel free to leave a like and or subscribe. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Close your eyes. Let everything around you go still. Imagine, if you can, a land of extraordinary beauty, a long, curved archipelago rising from the sea like the spine of a sleeping dragon. Mountains furrowed with cedar and pine. Rivers running clear and cold over smooth stones. Valleys of impossible green, terraced into steppes by the patient hands of 10,000 farmers. And everywhere, the sea surrounding, breathing, gray and silver in the early morning mist. This is Japan. And tonight, we are going to travel back a very long way back into the world that shaped it. But first, breathe. Let your body settle. There is no hurry here. The centuries will wait for us. We begin not with war, though war will come, but with quiet. With the way things were before the age of the warlords. Before the sword became the measure of all things. In the early centuries of the first millennium, Japan was a land still finding its shape. A place of clans and rice paddies, of mountain spirits and harvest prayers. The people farmed the narrow coastal plains where the mountains allowed it. They fished the bays and inlets. They buried their dead in great earthen mounds called kofun, some so large they can only truly be seen from the sky, shaped like keyholes pressed into the earth, surrounded by still water. These were the Yamato people, and from among their clans, one family slowly rose above the rest, the imperial line. The emperors of Japan. For centuries, the emperor sat at the center of everything, not as a warrior, but as something more like a living symbol, a bridge between the world of people and the world of gods, the kami, the spirits that the Japanese believed inhabited every river, every mountain, every curling wave. The emperor performed the rituals. He read the signs of heaven. He blessed the rice planting and gave thanks for the harvest. Power, in those early centuries, was a kind of sacred theater. The capital moved. Several times, in fact, as if the court was searching for just the right place to root itself. It settled, eventually, in a city that would come to be known as Heiankyo, the capital of peace and tranquility. What we now call Kyoto. It was laid out in a perfect grid, modeled after the great Tang dynasty capital of Chang'an in China, because Japan in this era looked to China the way a young student looks to a brilliant teacher, with admiration, with imitation, and with a quiet, growing sense that one day it might find its own voice. Heiankyo was exquisite. The imperial court that gathered the nobles, the poets, the musicians, the ladies-in-waiting behind their silk screens created one of the most refined cultures the world has ever seen. This was the Heian period, roughly 794 to 1185. Nearly 4 centuries of extraordinary elegance. Imagine the sound of a single koto string plucked in a candlelit room. Imagine the rustle of lead silk robes, 12 layers, each a different color, arranged so that the edges showed like petals. Imagine courtiers composing poetry at dawn, describing the precise color of the morning light on the garden pond, and sending the poem on paper perfumed with incense to someone they loved. This was a world so refined that it had a word mono no aware for the bittersweet feeling of beautiful things passing away. The cherry blossoms falling. The season changing. The awareness that nothing lasts forever, and that this impermanence is itself a kind of beauty. The court at Heiankyo was not thinking about war. It was thinking about beauty, about poetry, about the correct way to dress, the correct way to write, the correct way to fall in love and grieve and grow old. And yet, outside the gates of the capital, Japan was wild and difficult and dangerous. The rice paddies needed protecting. The mountain roads were plagued by bandits. The frontier provinces far from the scented corridors of the court were rough and ungoverned places where the imperial writ barely reached. The court nobles, absorbed in their poems and their politics, had little taste for violence. So they hired others to do it for them. They turned to a class of men who had been quietly growing in power for generations. Men who had learned to ride. Men who had learned to shoot a bow from horseback at full gallop. Men whose lives were shaped not by poetry, but by the discipline of the blade. The bushi. The warriors. Those we would later call samurai. The word samurai comes from a verb meaning to serve. And in these early centuries, that is precisely what they were: servants. Skilled, dangerous, indispensable servants of the court and of the great noble families who had grown wealthy on provincial lands. But servants have a way of becoming masters. The noble families of the Heian court, particularly two great clans, the Taira and the Minamoto, had long used warrior retainers to fight their private battles. As the decades passed, these clans grew stronger. Their private armies grew larger. Their ambitions grew bolder. The court, lost in its own beauty, did not quite notice what was happening. Or perhaps it noticed and simply couldn't stop it. The breaking point came in 1156. A dispute over who should sit on the imperial throne, a dispute that nobles had always managed through intrigue and whisper, erupted instead into open fighting in the streets of Kyoto. The Shogun Rebellion, it was called. And then, just 3 years later, another. The Heiji Rebellion. Swords were drawn in the capital. Men died in the elegant city of peace and tranquility. And when the dust settled, it was not a courtier who stood tallest, but a warrior. A man named Taira no Kiyomori, leader of the Taira clan, who found himself, astonishingly, at the center of power. For the first time, a military man controlled the imperial court. It would not be the last. Breathe. Feel the weight of the blanket. Feel the stillness of the room around you. We are watching something shift slowly, the way continents shift. A world turning on its axis. The age of courtiers giving way to the age of warriors. Beauty giving way to steel. But we are in no hurry. Let it come slowly. Taira no Kiyomori was a fascinating man. He had won power through warfare, but he governed very much in the manner of the court nobles he had displaced, marrying his daughter into the imperial family, surrounding himself with luxury, accumulating ranks and titles and the trappings of elegance. In some ways, he became exactly what he had replaced. And in doing so, he made enemies. Far from the capital, in the provinces to the east, in the wild, cold, forested region that would one day become the heartland of samurai culture, another great warrior clan was watching. And waiting. Minamoto. Rivals of the Taira for generations. Beaten down during the Heiji Rebellion. Their leader, Minamoto no Yoshitomo, killed. His sons, the survivors, scattered to distant provinces, raised in temples and remote estates, hidden away like seeds waiting for spring. One of those sons was named Yoritomo, a quiet, patient, deeply clever child who grew into a quiet, patient, deeply clever man. He would wait 20 years, and then he would move. But that story, the story of Yoritomo, of the Great Genpei War, of the clash between the Taira and the Minamoto that would tear Japan apart and birth something entirely new, that story belongs to the next chapter. The year is 1180. In Kyoto, Taira no Kiyomori rules with an iron hand wrapped in a courtier's sleeve. He has done something extraordinary as a warrior, risen to control the most refined court in the world, but he has not made peace with his enemies. He has only pushed them further away. And pushed men have a way of pushing back. A prince imperial blood, legitimate grievance, sends a secret message out of the capital. A call to arms, written on a thin scroll and rolled inside a hollow wooden statue of the Buddha. It travels carefully, by trusted hands, through mountain passes and river crossings, until it reaches the eastern provinces. until it reaches a man named Minamoto no Yoritomo. Yoritomo was 33 years old. He had spent 20 years in exile in the Aizu Peninsula, watched over by a Terra family who kept him alive, perhaps out of mercy, perhaps out of carelessness. He had grown up among the warrior families of the East. He had watched them. He had listened. He had learned which men could be trusted and which couldn't, which clans held old grudges against the Terra, which local lords might follow a Minamoto banner if one were raised. He was not a great battlefield commander. History is honest about this. He was something rarer and more valuable, a great organizer, a builder, a man who understood that wars are won not just in the moment of the sword stroke, but in the months and years of alliances forged beforehand. When the prince's message arrived, Yoritomo did not rush. He gathered. He negotiated. He sent riders to clan lords across the Kanto Plain, the broad, flat, fertile region east of the mountains that would one day become the heartland of warrior Japan. He called in old loyalties. He made new promises. And slowly, like a tide gathering itself before a wave, an army formed. The war that followed lasted 5 years. The Japanese call it the Genpei War, Gen and Pei being alternate readings of the characters for Minamoto and Terra. 5 years of battles across the length and breadth of Japan. Siege and counter-siege. Sea battles and mountain ambushes. Moments of extraordinary courage and moments of appalling cruelty, as all wars contain. The names of the battles have passed into legend. Dan no Yura, Ichino Tani, Yushima. Let me tell you about one of them. Not the largest, but perhaps the most beautiful and most terrible. Ichino Tani. The year is 1184. The Terra army has retreated westward from the capital, harried and diminished. They have made camp at Ichino Tani, a fortified position on the coast, protected on one side by the sea, and on the other by steep, nearly impassable cliffs. They believe themselves safe from the landward side. No army, their reason, could come down those cliffs. Minamoto no Yoshitsune disagreed. Yoshitsune was Yoritomo's younger brother, and where Yoritomo was cautious and calculating, Yoshitsune was something else entirely. A born warrior. Reckless, brilliant, beloved by his men. The kind of commander who leads from the front and wins not through superior numbers, but through sheer audacity. He took a small force of riders to the top of those cliffs. He looked down at the nearly vertical slope, rocky, dense with trees, a drop that would kill a horse if it stumbled. And he rode down it anyway. His men, either inspired or simply unwilling to be left behind, followed. The Terra, attacked from the direction they had declared impossible, broke and fled to their ships. Their camp burned behind them. Allow yourself to picture it for a moment, just before sleep pulls you further down. The cliffs, the dark pines, the gray winter sea below. A young man on a horse at the edge of an impossible slope, looking down, making a decision that would echo through history. And then the sound of hooves. The crashing of underbrush. The shouts first of shock, then of terror rising from the camp below. Some things happen so fast that the world barely has time to register them before they are over. The end came at Dan no Yura, a sea battle in the narrow straits between the islands of Honshu and Kyushu. The year 1185. The Terra fleet and the Minamoto fleet faced each other across the water. The Terra still had their greatest symbol aboard the young Emperor Antiku, a child, 6 years old, the grandson of Kiyomori himself, carried onto the ships as the court fled the capital, a living talisman of legitimacy. The battle began to turn. The Terra archers ran low on arrows. Key allies defected. The Minamoto ships closed in. What happened next is one of the most haunting moments in all of Japanese history. A woman, the emperor's grandmother, the formidable Terra no Tokiko, took the child emperor in her arms. She told him that beneath the waves there was another pure land, another beautiful world. She walked to the railing and stepped into the sea. Other Terra noble women followed, some carrying the imperial regalia, the sacred sword, the jewels that had passed from emperor to emperor for generations. The sword was lost that day, somewhere beneath those dark straits, and has never been recovered. The Terra were finished. Breathe. The sea is quiet now. The battle is over. 5 years of war, and what had it produced? A silence, a rearrangement, and something new. Yoritomo was not interested in Kyoto. He had watched what happened to powerful men who went to the capital and let it absorb them, who put on silk robes and forgot what they were. He had watched Terra no Kiyomori make exactly that mistake. He stayed in the east, in a small coastal city called Kamakura, tucked between the mountains and the sea, surrounded by loyal warrior families. In 1185, he established what history calls the first Bakufu, the tent government, the military headquarters, a parallel power not replacing the emperor in Kyoto, but existing alongside him, holding the real strings of governance. And in 1192, the emperor granted Yoritomo a title that had existed before but never meant so much. Seii Taishogun, barbarian subduing great general, shortened, over time, to simply shogun. For the next 7 centuries, that word would define Japan. The emperor would remain sacred, honored, surrounded by ritual. But the shogun, the supreme military commander, would govern, would make the real decisions, would hold the real power. Japan had become something it had never quite been before, a warrior state. There is something important to understand about what Yoritomo built in Kamakura, something that echoes through everything that follows. He did not simply seize power for himself. He created a system, a web of relationships between lord and retainer, between the shogun and his warrior vassals, built on a simple and very old idea: loyalty given, protection received, service in exchange for land, obedience in exchange for recognition. The Japanese word is giri, duty, obligation, the weight of what you owe to those above you and those below you. This was the foundation of what we call the feudal system, and it would hold Japan together, sometimes through iron discipline, sometimes through violence, sometimes through sheer cultural weight for hundreds of years. The samurai were no longer just hired swords. They were a class, a way of life, a set of values that would, over generations, harden into something almost like a religion. We will spend much of our night together exploring what that meant, what it cost, what it created. But for now, for this quiet moment, simply let the image settle. A city by the sea, mountains at its back, the smell of salt and pine. A man named Yoritomo, sitting in his compound in the eastern dusk, having done what his father and grandfather could not, having changed the shape of the world. He didn't know, of course, that what he built would outlast everything he imagined, that the office of shogun would survive for nearly 700 years, that the culture his warrior class would create, the art, the philosophy, the discipline, the tragedy would reach forward across the centuries and still be felt today. He was just a man in the dark, watching the sea, as we are all, in our own way, watching something larger than ourselves. Yoritomo died in 1199, a fall from a horse, most likely, though the chronicles are vague, and the Japanese have always left a little room for mystery in the deaths of great men. He left behind an institution, but not quite a dynasty. His sons were young, and the real power in Kamakura slipped sideways, not to the Minamoto family, but to the family of Yoritomo's wife, the Hojo clan. This is worth pausing on, because it tells you something essential about how power works in Japan during this era and perhaps in general. The emperor in Kyoto was a symbol. Real power was held by the shogun. But the early shoguns were often young, or weak, or both. And so real power came to be held by the shogun's regent, the man who governed in the shogun's name. The Hojo regents. Power nested inside power, like a set of lacquered boxes, each one opening to reveal another smaller one inside. The Japanese found this arrangement not particularly strange. There was something almost aesthetic about it, the way authority could be separated from its outward form, the way the man who bowed lowest in a room might be the most dangerous man in it. But let us not spend too long in the corridors of politics, because something else was happening in Kamakura, something quieter and more lasting than any reshuffling of power. Buddhism had come to Japan centuries earlier, flowing in from China and Korea like so much else in those early centuries. The court at Heiankyo had embraced it with characteristic elegance, elaborate rituals, magnificent temples, sutras chanted by shaven-headed monks in golden robes. Beautiful, ceremonial, something to be performed. But a new form of Buddhism was arriving now, from China, and it spoke a very different language. Zen, Chan in Chinese, Dhyana in Sanskrit. The word means simply meditation. No elaborate rituals. No vast pantheons of golden Buddhas. No sutras to be memorized and recited. Just this. Just the breath. Just the mind, sitting with itself, until the chatter quiets and something deeper opens. You can imagine why this appealed to warriors. The samurai lived with death the way farmers live with weather. It was simply part of the landscape, always present, always possible. A man who spent his life training with a sword, who might be called upon to kill or be killed on any given morning, needed something that addressed that reality directly. Not comfort exactly, not escape, but clarity. Zen offered clarity. The great Zen teachers Izai, Dogen arrived back from China carrying new ideas that spread through the warrior class like a clean wind through a smoky room. Sit still. Breathe. Don't think about death. Meet it. Look at it directly until the fear dissolves into something you can't quite name. Temples were built in the hills around Kamakura. The sound of bells in the early morning. Monks sweeping stone paths. Gardens of raked gravel, those famous gardens where the patterns in the sand were a kind of frozen meditation, a question asked in stone and silence. Let that image rest with you for a moment. A garden of gray gravel raked into careful furrows. A single stone. The sound of wind in a pine tree far away. There is no answer in a Zen garden. Only the question, held very still. The samurai of the Kamakura period were becoming something more defined, more self-conscious. They were beginning to articulate, slowly, what they were, what they stood for. The code that would eventually be called Bushido, the way of the warrior, was not written down yet. It was lived and argued about, and passed from law to retainer and father to son. But its core ideas were forming. Loyalty. Absolute, unconditional loyalty to one's lord. Not the cautious, negotiated loyalty of a merchant or a courtier, but something total. Something that in its ideal form asked a man to be willing to die, to choose death rather than fail the one he served. Courage. Not the absence of fear. The samurai were honest about fear, in their poetry and their letters, but the ability to act despite it. To move forward when everything in you wants to stop. And honor. Meo. A concept so central that its loss was considered worse than death. A samurai who shamed himself, who failed in his duty, who was captured rather than dying in battle, such a man faced a particular reckoning. Seppuku. Ritual self-disembowelment. The taking of one's own life in a prescribed, formal way that transformed even death into a kind of discipline. We will encounter this concept again as our story continues. It will not become easier to sit with, but it is essential to understanding the world. We are traveling through a world that took honor so seriously it made death preferable to disgrace. For now, breathe. You are warm. You are safe. These things happened a very long time ago and in a land very far from here, and we are only watching, only listening, carried gently on the current of the story. And then, from the west, came the storm, the Mongols. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire was the largest land empire the world had ever seen, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the doorstep of Europe. Genghis Khan had built it. His grandsons were expanding it. City after city, kingdom after kingdom, fell before the Mongol armies, their cavalry, their siege engines, their absolute, terrifying efficiency. Japan had heard about this, distantly, the way you hear about a flood in a far country, with sympathy and a vague relief that the water has not reached you. Then a letter arrived. From Kublai Khan himself, the great Khan, ruler of the Mongol Empire and Emperor of China. The letter was courteous on its surface. It addressed Japan as a neighboring country, expressed a desire for friendly relations, and suggested it might be in Japan's interest to pay tribute. The meaning underneath the courtesy was unmistakable. Submit, or face what every other kingdom has faced. The Hojo regent, a man named Tokumun, 20 years old, steely, trained in Zen, did not reply. The Mongols sent more letters, increasingly direct, increasingly threatening. Tokumun did not reply. He was, instead, preparing. The first fleet came in 1274. 900 ships, 30,000 Mongol and Korean and Chinese soldiers, carrying weapons Japan had never seen, exploding shells that burst in the air above the samurai formations, poisoned arrows shot in vast clouds rather than the single, formal archery that Japanese warriors practiced. A way of war utterly alien to everything the samurai knew. The individual Japanese warriors who rode out to meet them, expecting the formal, ritualized combat they had trained for, the exchange of names and challenges before battle, were overwhelmed. Cut down by arrows before they could close. Panicked by the explosions, the Japanese fell back. And then, that night, a storm blew in from the sea. The Mongol fleet, anchored in the bay, took the full force of it. Ships dragged against each other, broke apart, sank. Thousands drowned. The survivors pulled back and sailed home. Japan breathed. 7 years later, they came again. 140,000 men. The largest seaborne invasion force the world had assembled up to that point. 2 fleets, sailing from different ports, converging on Japan's western shores. This time the Japanese were ready, or as ready as they could be. Walls had been built along the coastline. Warriors stationed. Months of preparation. And still the Mongols came ashore, and still the fighting was brutal and desperate and going badly. And then, again the sea. A typhoon struck with such ferocity, such perfect and annihilating force, that the Mongol fleet was not damaged but destroyed. Ship after ship rolled and broke and sank. Of the 140,000 men who had sailed for Japan, perhaps 40,000 made it home. The rest were drowned, or killed on the beaches, or captured. The Japanese had a name for those storms. Kamikaze. The divine winds. The gods themselves, they believed, had risen to protect the sacred islands. The very sea had become a weapon in Japan's defense. It is a beautiful idea, and not entirely wrong, perhaps in the sense that Japan's geography, its volatile weather, the same seas that had kept it separate from the continent for thousands of years, had indeed protected it at its moment of greatest danger. But the truth, as always, is also more complicated. The samurai had fought, had bled, had held the beaches under impossible conditions, waiting for a deliverance they had no right to expect. Their courage was real, whatever the weather did afterward. And the wars had changed something in Japan. The Hojo had promised rewards to the warriors who had fought, land, recognition, advancement. But there was no land to give. The Mongols had been defeated, not conquered. There were no new territories to distribute. The warriors who had sacrificed everything went home with nothing but their wounds and their honor. Resentment simmered. The Kamakura system, built on the exchange of loyalty for reward, service for land, had made a promise it could not keep. And systems that cannot keep their promises do not last. The end of Kamakura came in 1333. Not from outside, not from another Mongol fleet, but from within. From a coalition of disaffected warriors and a determined emperor named Go-Daigo who wanted, remarkably, to actually govern his own country. The last Hojo regent, surrounded, his world ending, walked into a building with 800 of his men. They died together, by their own hands, in the Zen discipline they had practiced all their lives. The city of Kamakura burned, and Japan, once again, reshuffled its pieces and tried to find a new arrangement. Takauji is one of those figures whose history isn't quite sure what to do with. He fought on the side of the Emperor Go-Daigo when it suited him, helped bring down the Kamakura shogunate, helped restore imperial rule, and then, almost immediately, turned against the emperor he had just restored, drove him from Kyoto, and installed a different emperor on the throne. One more willing to let Takauji do as he pleased. Was he a traitor? A pragmatist? A man simply doing what powerful men in unstable times have always done, attaching himself to whatever cause was rising and detaching himself the moment it stopped serving him? History rarely gives us clean answers about men like Takauji. He was probably all of those things at once. What he built, in 1336, was the second great shogunate, the Ashikaga, named for his family's home province. And unlike Yoritomo, who had stayed deliberately in his eastern city of Kamakura, far from the seductions of the court, Takauji moved his government to Kyoto itself, into the heart of the old world, the silk and the gardens and the ancient, lead elegance. Some historians have wondered if this was a mistake. The Ashikaga period, which lasted, in its fashion, until 1573, is one of the most complicated and most fascinating eras in all of Japanese history. Complicated because the shogunate was never truly stable. Fascinating because of what it produced despite, or perhaps because of, that instability. Let me paint it in broad strokes, the way you might describe a landscape from a great height. The Ashikaga shoguns sat in Kyoto. They governed or tried to govern through a network of regional military governors called shugo. These were the great lords of the provinces, the men who controlled the land and the warriors who lived on it. The shogun needed them. They needed the shogun. It was a marriage of convenience, and like many such marriages, it was prone to discord. Over the generations of the Ashikaga period, power leaked steadily away from the center. The regional lords grew more autonomous. The shogun's authority, never absolute to begin with, became more and more formality, a title rather than a reality. Japan was slowly, quietly, coming apart at its seams. And then in 1467, it came apart all at once. The Onin War. It began, absurdly enough, as a dispute over succession. Two powerful lords, Yamane Sozen and Hosokawa Katsumoto, both supposed to be loyal vassals of the shogun, backed different candidates for a family inheritance. It was exactly the kind of petty political quarrel that ambitious men in a weakening state are always picking. Except this one didn't stay petty. Armies gathered in Kyoto. Not armies from far-off provinces, armies encamped in the streets of the capital itself. In the gardens. Around the temples. Soldiers sleeping in the corridors where courtiers had once composed poetry. The fighting that erupted in 1467 lasted 11 years. 11 years of war in and around Kyoto. The city, the ancient, irreplaceable city of temples and palaces, and all the accumulated beauty of the Heian court, was gutted. Burned district by district. Great temples reduced to ash. Neighborhoods that had stood for 4 centuries gone in an afternoon. The people who could flee, fled. The emperor lived in poverty so acute that he could not afford the rituals that were his entire reason for existing. There are records of the imperial family selling calligraphy, the emperor's own brushwork, on the street, to buy food. The shogunate was not destroyed by the Onin War, exactly, but it was hollowed out, made into a shell, a name without a substance. When the fighting finally exhausted itself, and the armies dispersed, no one had won. The dispute that had started it was unresolved. The shogun remained in Kyoto, diminished. The regional lords went back to their provinces and began, quietly, to stop looking to Kyoto for permission to do anything at all. Japan had entered a new age. The Japanese call it Sengo, the Warring States period. Breathe. Notice the stillness of the room, the particular quality of quiet that exists when a place is at rest. There is something peaceful about hearing of chaos from a great distance. The wars of the 15th century are very far from you. They are a story now, a shape, a thing that happened and resolved and left behind a world we can understand. Let that distance hold you. The Sengo period, roughly 1467 to 1568, though its edges are blurry, as the edges of ages always are, was a century of almost continuous warfare. Across every province of Japan, the old order dissolved and new power structures formed in its place. The shugo, those regional governors, were often replaced by men who had served under them. Stewards, deputies, local strongmen who had spent generations building loyalty among the farmers and warriors of a single valley or a single river plain. Men who knew every road, every ford, every family that owed them something. The Japanese have a word for this process, gekkokujo. It means, roughly, the low overcomes the high. The undermining of those above by those below. Not revolution exactly, there was no ideology, no manifesto. Just the patient, grinding reality that in a time of chaos, the man who can actually control his immediate territory is more powerful than the man with an impressive title 3 provinces away. New lords emerged. They built castles, not the palace temples of earlier eras, but functional, military structures on high ground, dominating the valleys around them. They wrote laws, collected taxes, administered justice, built roads. They became, in their own small domains, something very like kings. These were the daimyo, the great domain lords, the figures who would define the next century of Japanese history. And here is something worth dwelling on, as you drift. Because the Sengo period was not only a time of destruction, it was also strangely, paradoxically, a time of extraordinary creativity. The same instability that tore apart the old order freed things that the old order had kept confined. Art forms that had been the exclusive property of the court began to reach wider audiences. The spare, severe aesthetic of Zen which the warrior class had embraced in Kamakura merged with something warmer, something more human, and produced new things. No theater. The slow, masked, intensely stylized drama that explored grief and spirits and the weight of the past. Performed originally for warrior audiences who understood something about all of those things. Ikebana, the art of flower arrangement, which sounds gentle until you understand that it was, at its deepest level, a meditation on impermanence, on the fact that the most beautiful things are beautiful precisely because they will not last. The tea ceremony, chinoyu, perhaps the most remarkable invention of this troubled age. A small room, a few simple objects, a bowl, a whisk, a scoop, a jar of powdered green tea, a host and 1 or 2 guests. An hour of extraordinary, enforced stillness in the middle of a world at war. The tea ceremony asked something almost impossible of the samurai who practiced it: to set down the sword, to move slowly, to attend to tiny things with full attention. The temperature of the water, the sound of it beginning to boil, the weight of a ceramic bowl in both hands, the color of the tea that particular vivid, living green. It was invented, or rather perfected, by a man named Senno Rikyu, and it was embraced, ardently, by some of the most violent men of the age, perhaps because they needed it most. In a world where everything was uncertain, where today's ally was tomorrow's enemy, where man could rise from nothing and fall back to nothing in a single season, the tea room offered something rare. 1 hour that was complete in itself. 1 hour that asked nothing of you but your presence. Ichigo Ichi. One time, one meeting. Every gathering is unique and will never come again. The bowl you hold, the steam rising from it, the particular quality of light through that particular paper screen on that particular afternoon, these things will not repeat. Be here. Only here. Entirely here. It is an idea that belongs to its century. Born from chaos. Made beautiful by the knowledge of how quickly things end. Let your thoughts drift now, if they want to. Don't chase them. Don't hold them. Just let them move like clouds forming and dissolving, casting brief shadows, passing on. The Sengo period is all around us in the dark. 100 small wars in 100 mountain valleys. Castles lit by fires. Messengers riding hard through the night. Lords making promises they hope to keep, and plans they know might fail. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a small room. A bowl of tea. 2 people sitting in silence, listening to the water. We are not yet at the great unifiers, the extraordinary trio of men who will, one by one, begin to reassemble Japan's fractured pieces into something whole. That story is coming. It is one of the most dramatic in all of this long history. But first we needed to understand the fracture. To feel, even a little, what a century of war and dissolution does to a country. What it costs. What strange and lovely things grow in its rubble. Japan at the end of the Sengo period is exhausted. Brilliant. Scarred. Full of men who have known nothing but war, and who have, in the spaces between wars, made extraordinary things. Ready, without knowing it, for someone to come and change everything. There is a famous story told about Nobunaga as a young man. He was, by all accounts, an alarming child. Wild. Unpredictable. He wandered the streets of his castle town eating food from market stalls with his hands, sleeves untucked, laughing too loudly. His retainers despaired of him. His own father reportedly said that if this boy ever ruled Owari, the clan was finished. They called him Owari no Outsuke, the fool of Owari. When his father died and Nobunaga inherited the clan, his senior retainers resigned in disgust. A rival, his own brother, backed by those retainers, moved to take power. Nobunaga killed him, and from that moment forward, no one called him a fool again. What made Nobunaga extraordinary, what separates him from the 100 other ambitious daimyo who were doing what he was doing, fighting who he was fighting, dreaming what he was dreaming, was not his brutality, though he was brutal. It was not his ambition, though he had ambition in quantities that seemed almost inhuman. It was his mind. Nobunaga thought differently. He looked at the way war was conducted in Japan, the individual heroics, the cavalry charges, the samurai tradition of single combat and personal honor, and he saw the limitations. Romantic, yes. Impressive, yes. But slow. Expensive. Dependent on the courage and skill of individual men, which meant dependent on things you couldn't control. He looked at something else instead. Eshigaru. Foot soldiers. Common men, farmers mostly, who had always been considered the least important element of any army. They were used as skirmishers, as labors, as fodder. No one trained them seriously. No one equipped them well. Nobunaga equipped them with guns. The Portuguese had arrived in Japan in 1543, just 9 years after Nobunaga was born, and with them came the arquebus, the matchlock firearm. Japan had seen nothing like it. Most daimyo treated the gun as a curiosity, useful, perhaps, in limited circumstances, but noisy, slow to reload, dependent on dry weather. Hardly a replacement for the bow. Nobunaga understood what everyone else was missing. One gun is a curiosity. 1,000 guns, drilled to fire in coordinated volleys, is a revolution. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, Nobunaga faced the cavalry of the Takeda clan, the finest horsemen in Japan, legendary, terrifying, riding animals bred for generations to carry armored warriors at full charge. He lined up 3,000 arquebusiers in rotating ranks behind wooden palisades. As the Takeda cavalry charged, one rank fired, stepped back to reload, and the next rank fired, and the next. An unbroken wall of smoke and noise and lead. The Takeda cavalry was destroyed, in minutes, by farmers with guns. The age of the cavalry charge in Japan ended that afternoon. But Nobunaga was not only a military innovator. He was something harder to name, a force of nature that moved through the existing order of things and simply refused to be constrained by it. He abolished the toll barriers that dotted the roads of his territories, the checkpoints where merchants paid fees to pass through. Other lords collected these fees as revenue and considered them their right. Nobunaga saw them as friction, as obstacles to the movement of goods and people and information. He tore them down. He promoted men based on ability rather than birth. In a world where your family name determined everything, where a man born to a farmer stayed a farmer's son regardless of his talents, Nobunaga looked at what a man could do and gave him authority accordingly. His greatest general, the man who would ultimately succeed him, was the son of a peasant. A man named Hideyoshi, who began his career carrying Nobunaga's sandals. We will come to Hideyoshi shortly. There is another side to Nobunaga that the story requires us to acknowledge. He was capable of extraordinary cruelty. The great Buddhist monastery complex of Mount Hiei and Ryakuji, perched on the mountain above Kyoto, center of the Tendai sect, a place of enormous religious and cultural significance that had stood for 7 centuries, had made the mistake of opposing Nobunaga politically, of sheltering his enemies, of refusing to stay out of the wars of the warlords. In 1571, Nobunaga surrounded the mountain with his armies. He burned everything, every building, every temple, every store of scripture and art accumulated over 7 centuries. He killed everyone on the mountain. Monks, students, women, children. 3,000 people, by some estimates. Perhaps more. He was 37 years old. When his advisors expressed discomfort, he reportedly said that he was not the one who had forced their hand, that they had chosen their side and must live or not live with that choice. This is the man some of his contemporaries called Darakuten Mao, the demon king of the 6th heaven. He seemed, at times, to embrace the title. Let that sit at a distance. You are here, warm, in the dark. These events are very far away, separated from you not only by oceans, but by 5 centuries of time. They are part of the story of how a world was made. Painful parts, but parts that belong to the shape of things. Breathe. By 1582, Nobunaga controlled perhaps a third of Japan. The most strategically important third, the central provinces, the approaches to Kyoto, the Great Plain around Nagoya. He had neutralized or destroyed nearly every rival in his path. The unification of Japan, something no one had managed for over a century, was beginning to look not like a dream, but like a matter of time. And then, on the 13th of June, 1582, Nobunaga stopped at a temple called Honnoji in Kyoto, traveling with only a small escort. Relaxed, perhaps, in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. One of his own generals, a man named Akechi Mitsuhide, turned his army around on the road and marched it back to Kyoto. Surrounded, outnumbered by thousands to one, Nobunaga fought with what he had: a bow, then a spear, until the spear broke, and then retreated to his chambers and set fire to the building rather than be captured. He was 48 years old. The unification of Japan was left unfinished. History loves this moment, the Honnoji incident, as it is called. Scholars have debated for centuries why Akechi Mitsuhide turned traitor. Was it a personal insult? Nobunaga had reportedly humiliated him in public? Was it a political calculation? Was there a conspiracy involving other lords, other interests? No one knows. Mitsuhide himself was killed 13 days later, pursued and defeated by Hideyoshi the sandal carrier, the peasant son who moved with such astonishing speed that history gave him a nickname: the monkey. Quick, clever, impossible to catch. Hideyoshi would take up the work Nobunaga had left unfinished. But that, too, is the next chapter. What Nobunaga leaves behind beyond the wars, beyond the bodies, beyond the charred stones of Mount Hiei is something harder to measure and more lasting. He had shown that it was possible, that a single man, with sufficient will and sufficient intelligence and a complete willingness to ignore the rules that everyone else was following, could move the world. He had broken the feudal stasis, cracked open a century of paralysis. Proving that Japan could be unified was in the process of being unified if only someone would finish the work. He had brought guns into Japanese warfare and changed it forever. He had brought free trade to his territories and changed commerce forever. He had promoted talent over birth and, in doing so, quietly undermined one of the most fundamental assumptions of the world he lived in. The fool of Owari, who was never, for a single moment, a fool. 13 days. That is how long Akechi Mitsuhide, the man who had betrayed and killed Nobunaga at Honnoji, lasted as the most powerful man in Japan. 13 days. Because Hideyoshi was already moving. When the news of Honnoji reached him, Hideyoshi was far to the west, in the middle of a siege. He had been campaigning for months, grinding down a stubborn castle on the inland sea, far from Kyoto, far from the center of things. He made peace with the enemy he was besieging quickly, quietly, giving up gains he had spent months earning, because the gains no longer mattered, and turned his army around. 50 miles in a day, then another 50. His soldiers were running, not marching. The officers keeping pace on horseback. Villages blurring past in the early morning dark. Farmers stopping in their fields to watch this river of men moving with such improbable speed. Hideyoshi arrived before Mitsuhide had time to consolidate anything. Before the other great lords had decided what to do, which way to lean, whose banner to stand under. He fought. He won. He stood over the body of the man who had killed Nobunaga. And then he looked around at the landscape of power that had suddenly, shockingly, rearranged itself. And he began to think. Toyotomi Hideyoshi is one of history's great improbabilities. He was born, around 1537, to a peasant family in Owari, the same province as Nobunaga. His father was a foot soldier, perhaps, or a farmer who occasionally carried a spade. The family had no land worth speaking of, no name worth anything, no connections to the warrior class that might have opened a door. He was small, ugly, by the standards of the time, thin-faced, with long fingers and restless eyes. Someone called him Saru, the monkey, and the name stuck because it was apartment. He moved like a monkey, thought like one quickly, laterally, always looking for the branch no one else had noticed. He attached himself to Nobunaga as a servant boy, carried his sandals, warmed his armor before battles so the cold metal wouldn't shock his lord skin. He watched everything. He said little. He waited. And slowly, year by year, he rose. Not through birth. Not through inheritance. Through sheer relentless competence, through the ability to solve whatever problem was in front of him faster and more completely than anyone else. When Nobunaga needed a castle built, Hideyoshi built it in days when everyone said it would take months. When Nobunaga needed a difficult lord persuaded, Hideyoshi persuaded him. When Nobunaga needed an enemy defeated, Hideyoshi defeated him. He became, in time, Nobunaga's most trusted general. The peasant boy who carried sandals, commanding armies. And now Nobunaga was dead, and Hideyoshi had avenged him, and the question of who would rule Japan was suddenly, terrifyingly open. There were other lords, stronger in lineage, more legitimate by every measure the old world recognized. Men who had warrior blood going back generations, who looked at this small, strange, low-born general and felt something close to contempt. Hideyoshi negotiated with them, flattered them, gave them titles and territories, made them feel, as much as possible, that they were partners rather than subordinates, even as he quietly ensured that all the real levers of power remained in his own hands. He was, in some ways, the opposite of Nobunaga. Where Nobunaga forced the world to bend through sheer overwhelming pressure, Hideyoshi bent himself, made himself agreeable, made himself unthreatening, made himself the man everyone could work with until the moment it was too late to work against him. By 1590, just 8 years after Honnoji, Hideyoshi controlled all of Japan. Every province, every lord. The last holdouts in the far northeast submitted, one by one, to the reality that resistance was futile and survival required accommodation. Japan was unified. For the first time in over a century. Let that settle. A peasant son had done what emperors and shoguns and generations of the finest warrior families in Japan had failed to do. He had put the country back together. Hideyoshi governed with remarkable energy. He conducted a vast land survey measuring every rice paddy, recording every yield, assessing taxes with a precision that Japan had never seen. He issued the sword hunt and edict requiring all non-samurai to surrender their weapons, drawing a clear line for the first time between the warrior class and everyone else. Farmers were farmers. Samurai were samurai. The social order was to be fixed, hardened, made permanent. In some ways, this was generous. It ended the era of the farmer who might one day become a general. Yes, but it also meant that farmers no longer had to be soldiers. They could simply farm. In other ways, it closed the door Hideyoshi himself had walked through, the door through which a peasant boy might rise to rule a nation. He pulled the ladder up behind him, as powerful men so often do. But there is a shadow that falls across Hideyoshi's achievement, and we cannot pass it by entirely. In 1592, with Japan unified and peaceful and no more internal enemies to fight, Hideyoshi turned his gaze outward. He would conquer Korea, then China, then, perhaps, all of Asia. It is hard to know what drove this. The momentum of a military machine that had known nothing but war for a century. Personal megalomania, grown enormous in the hothouse of absolute power. A need to give his vast army of samurai, men trained for violence, with nothing left to fight, something to do before they turned on each other. Probably all of these things. The Korean campaigns were catastrophic. 2 invasions, in 1592 and 1597. The Japanese armies achieved early successes. The peninsula's defenders were caught unprepared, but the Korean Navy, under the brilliant Admiral Yi Sun-sin, destroyed Japanese supply lines with devastating effect. Chinese forces intervened on Korea's behalf. The Japanese fought and retreated and fought again, and the whole enterprise ground itself down over 6 years into something that served no one. Hundreds of thousands died. Korean civilians most of all the land they lived on, becoming the stage for a war they had not chosen. Hideyoshi died in 1598, before the troops came home. His last words, recorded by those present, were a wish that his young son might be protected. He had no answer for what the invasions had been for. Breathe. The complications of powerful lives, the ways that greatness and damage live so close together that you can't pull them apart. These are not comfortable things to sit with. But they are true things. And true things, held gently in the dark, have a way of becoming simply part of the texture of understanding. Not resolved. Not excused. Just known. What Hideyoshi left behind, beyond the wars and the surveys and the tragedy of Korea, was a Japan almost ready for its long peace. Almost. Because there was one more question to answer. One that Hideyoshi had tried to settle by establishing a council of regents to govern until his young son came of age, but which his death immediately reopened. Who would rule? 5 great lords sat on that council. 5 men who had sworn to protect Hideyoshi's heir. 5 men who were, within months of Hideyoshi's death, choosing sides, forming alliances, calculating odds. Among them, the most powerful, the most patient, the most careful of all. A lord from the eastern provinces. A man who had waited his entire life for exactly this moment. Tokugawa Ieyasu. Tokugawa Ieyasu was 60 years old in 1602. He had been waiting, in one form or another, for most of those 60 years. As a child he had been a hostage passed between rival clans, a bargaining piece in other people's games, spending years in households that were not his own, learning the landscape of power by watching it from the outside. Learning, perhaps most importantly, what patience looked like. What it cost. What it was worth. Under Nobunaga he had been an ally powerful in his own right, controlling the eastern provinces, but always subordinate. Always watching. Under Hideyoshi he had been a vassal, ordered to abandon his ancestral lands and relocate to the east to the Kanto Plain, the broad flat region around a small castle town called Edo. It was meant, perhaps, to diminish him, to move him away from the center of things. Instead, Ieyasu took the Kanto, the largest agricultural plain in Japan, and built it into the foundation of everything that followed. He waited. He administered. He built. When Hideyoshi died in 1598, the Council of Regents began to fracture almost immediately. The 5 lords who had sworn to protect Hideyoshi's young heir divided, quietly at first and then less quietly, into 2 camps. Those who clustered around the boy's mother and the memory of Hideyoshi's legacy, led by a meticulous administrator named Ishida Mitsunari, a man who was brilliant and cold and deeply, fatally unpopular with the samurai class he needed. And those who gathered around Ieyasu were drawn by his age, his steadiness, the simple reality that he was the most powerful lord in Japan, and had been for years. Alliances formed. Letters were sent. Promises made in dark rooms. For 2 years the tension built, the way weather builds before a storm, quietly, with increasing pressure, the air becoming something you can feel on your skin. And then, on the 21st day of the 10th month of the year 1600, on a narrow mountain valley road in the province of Minu, at a place called Sekigahara, the storm broke. Sekigahara. Even now, 400 years later, the name resonates in Japanese history like a struck bell. The 2 armies that faced each other that October morning were enormous by any measure. Perhaps 160,000 men in total, spread across the valley floor and the surrounding hillsides, in the thin gray light before sunrise. Ieyasu's forces to the east. Ishida's coalition to the west. The fog was thick that morning. The armies could barely see each other. The men stood in their formations and breathed vapor into the cold air and waited. When the fighting began, it was ferocious. The Western forces had the numbers, the position. For hours the outcome was genuinely uncertain, the lines surging back and forth across the valley floor, while the hillside lords, men who had committed to neither side, waiting to see which way the wind blew, watched from their elevated positions. And then one of them moved. A lord named Kobayakawa Hideaki, positioned on a commanding hill above the western flank, had been negotiating with both sides for weeks. No one knew which way he would fall. He fell toward Ieyasu. His 15,000 men poured down the hillside into the western flank. Others followed. Lords who had been waiting for exactly this signal, this permission to choose the winning side. The Western coalition collapsed. Ishida Mitsunari fled, was captured 3 days later in a peasant's hut in the mountains, and was executed in Kyoto. The battle had lasted 6 hours. Ieyasu stood in the valley at Sekigahara as the autumn light faded, and Japan was his. He did not rush. He spent 3 years settling accounts, rewarding those who had stood with him, redistributing the lands of those who had not, placing his allies in strategic positions around the country. He constructed a web of obligation and dependency that would hold Japan in place for generations. In 1603, the emperor granted him the title Issei Taishogun, shogun. The third great shogunate began. The Tokugawa and Ieyasu, mindful of how the Ashikaga had lost power when their shoguns became too absorbed in Kyoto, did something careful and deliberate. He held the title for 2 years, then passed it to his son. This was a message to every lord in Japan, delivered without words. The Tokugawa shogunate is not a man. It is a dynasty. It will not end when I end. It will not be challenged when I am gone. The line of succession is established, and it is permanent, and anyone who doubts this is invited to consider Sekigahara. He died in 1616, at the age of 73, having done what he set out to do. Breathe. Let your eyes be heavy. Let your thoughts move slowly, the way a river moves in its wide lower reaches, broad and dark and unhurried, carrying everything gently toward the sea. We are nearly at the end of our journey. One more chapter waits, the long peace. But before we leave Ieyasu entirely, let us sit with something about him that is easy to overlook. He was not, by any obvious measure, the most remarkable of the 3 great unifiers. Nobunaga was more dramatic, more visionary, more willing to burn the world down in service of his ambitions. Hideyoshi was more improbable, more charming, the greatest story, in the narrative sense, the peasant who became a king. Ieyasu was simply patient. Patient when he was a child hostage in a stranger's house. Patient when he watched Nobunaga lead and had to follow. Patient when Hideyoshi sent him east to the Kanto, and he went without complaint. Patient through the 2 years of political maneuvering after Hideyoshi's death. Patient through the 6 hours of Sekigahara. Patient in building the machinery of a government designed to last not a lifetime but centuries. There is a Japanese proverb, probably invented after the fact, as proverbs usually are, to make sense of something that had already happened. If the cuckoo does not sing, Nobunaga says kill it. Hideyoshi says make it sing. Ieyasu says wait for it to sing. 3 men, 3 dispositions, 3 ways of forcing the world to yield. Ieyasu's way lasted longest. His castle town of Edo, that small place in the east, the one Hideyoshi had meant as a kind of exile, would grow, under the Tokugawa, into the largest city in the world. We know it today by a different name, Tokyo. Let that land softly, a hostage child, relocated to a place meant to diminish him, builds the foundations of the largest city on earth. The world is strange and long and full of reversals. The year is 1615. The last castle that dared to resist the Tokugawa has fallen. Osaka Castle, vast, magnificent, built by Hideyoshi himself as a monument to his own extraordinary life, has burned. Inside it, Hideyoshi's son. The heir he asked his council to protect. The boy Ieyasu had sworn, along with the others, to serve. The boy died in the fire. And with him, the last serious challenge to Tokugawa authority. Japan fell quiet. 250 years of quiet. That is what the Edo period was. The longest unbroken peace in Japanese history. Perhaps the longest sustained peace of any major nation in the pre-modern world. 250 years in which no great battle was fought on Japanese soil. No invasion came. No warlord rose to challenge the order of things. The Tokugawa achieved this through a system of extraordinary, almost architectural thoroughness. The great lords, the daimyo, those powerful men who had spent the previous century fighting each other with such energy, were not destroyed. They were managed. Each lord was required to spend alternating years in Edo and in his home province. 1 year at the shogun's capital. 1 year at home. Back and forth, endlessly, for the duration of the Tokugawa period. Sankinkotai. Alternate attendance. The journeys were expensive. Enormous processions. A great lord traveling to Edo might bring hundreds of thousands of attendants, all of whom needed feeding and housing along the road. The costs were ruinous. Deliberately so. A lord who spent his fortune on travel and on maintaining 2 separate households, one in Edo, one at home, had little left to spend on armies. And while the lord was in Edo, his family stayed behind. And while the lord was home, his family stayed in Edo. Hostages, always. As Ieyasu himself had once been a hostage. He knew what it meant. He knew how it worked. The genius of the system was that it looked like ceremony, like honor, like the natural order of a well-governed state. No one was in chains. Everyone simply understood the terms. Let that thought drift past. A country held in place by the choreography of obligation. Everyone moving in their appointed patterns. The great processions on the roads. The seasons turning. The rice growing and being harvested and growing again. The cities grew. Edo most of all, swelling decade by decade into a city of 1 million people by the 18th century, when London held perhaps half that. A city of merchants and craftsmen and actors and artists, of bathhouses and noodle stalls and kabuki theaters lit by lamplight. Because peace, it turns out, is extraordinarily generative. When samurai do not fight, they have to do something with themselves. Some became administrators, scholars, teachers. Some became, in their enforced idleness, patrons and practitioners of the arts. The culture of the Edo period is almost overwhelming in its richness. Kabuki theater, loud, colorful, melodramatic, beloved by the merchant class that the old samurai order officially looked down upon and secretly adored. Actors in white makeup and elaborate costume, voices trained to carry to the back of enormous wooden theaters, playing ghosts and lovers and scheming villains, to audiences who wept and shouted and threw cushions in appreciation. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints. Images of the floating world of beautiful women in fine robes, of actors mid-performance, of landscapes so perfectly observed that you could feel the weather in them. Hokusai's great wave, rearing above tiny boats beneath the distant cone of Fuji. Hiroshide's rain falling in gray diagonal lines across a wooden bridge at dusk. These images would travel, eventually, to Europe, would find their way into the studios of Monet and Van Gogh and Toulouse-Lautrec, and quietly reshape the way Western artists thought about composition and color and the depiction of the natural world. Japan, sealed from the outside world, reached out through art and touched everything. Breathe. The floating world. Ukiyo. It meant, originally, the sorrowful world, the world of suffering and impermanence that Buddhism asked its followers to transcend. But during the Edo period the meaning shifted, softened, became almost an embrace. The floating world. The world of pleasure and beauty and the present moment. the theater, the tea house, the print, the song. Things that float are not permanent. Everyone knew that. They floated because they were light, and they were light because they would not last, and they would not last because nothing does, and this, somehow, made them more beautiful, not less. Mono no aware, the bittersweet knowledge of impermanence. The same feeling the Heian court poets had reached for 1,000 years before. Japan had come a very long way and arrived, somehow, at the same tender truth. The samurai class, in the long peace of the Edo period, became something transformed. With no wars to fight, they fought in dojos, trained endlessly in forms that might never be used, wrote poetry, practiced calligraphy, studied Confucian philosophy, became, in some cases, indistinguishable from the scholars and administrators they nominally ranked above. And the code they had lived by Bushido, the way of the warrior, was finally written down, formally articulated, made into a philosophy rather than just a practice. The irony is not subtle. Bushido, the code of the warrior, was written in its fullest form during the longest peace in Japanese history, by men who had never fought a real battle. Perhaps distance is what allowed it, the ability to see clearly what something was without being inside it. Or perhaps, as has been suggested, the code was never quite a description of how samurai actually lived, but an aspiration, a beautiful idea of what a warrior ought to be, an idea powerful enough to shape the culture long after the warriors themselves were gone. The outside world did not forget Japan. For 200 years, the Tokugawa policy of Sakoku, the closed country, had kept foreign ships away. Portuguese missionaries, who had arrived in the 16th century and spread Christianity through parts of southern Japan, had been expelled. Trade was restricted to a single Dutch outpost on a small artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor, and a limited commerce with China and Korea. Japan had chosen stillness, had chosen to remain exactly as it was. But stillness, in a changing world, is its own kind of motion. While Japan was still, the world was not. Steam engines, industrialized navies, rifles that loaded from the breech rather than the muzzle. An entirely new order of military technology, developed in Europe and America, spreading across the globe. When the American Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay in 1853 with 4 black steam-powered warship ships unlike anything Japan had ever seen, moving without wind, bristling with guns, the shock was physical. The country that had sealed itself away now understood, with terrible clarity, what 250 years of peace had cost. The outside world had not been sleeping. The response, in the 15 years that followed, was one of the most remarkable in history. Factions formed. The old order cracked. Arguments erupted that had been waiting, pressurized, for generations about what Japan was, what it should become, whether the shogunate could survive, whether the emperor should be restored to real power. In 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate fell. The Emperor Meiji was restored. The feudal age, that long, extraordinary, terrible, beautiful age that had begun when the first Minamoto warriors rode east from a burning capital, was over. Japan would become, in the following decades, something that no one in 1600 could have imagined. An industrialized nation, a modern state, a country that took the outside world's technology and made it entirely its own. But that is another story, another long night's journey. Tonight we have traveled 11 centuries. We have walked the silk corridors of Heiankyu and felt the autumn light on the maple trees. We have watched Yoritomo build his warrior government by the cold eastern sea. We have stood on the beach as the divine winds tore the Mongol fleet apart. We have sat, for one quiet hour, in a tea room while the world outside burned. We have watched Nobunaga ride, watched Hideyoshi run, watched Ieyasu wait. We have seen the floating world drift past the kabuki actors and the woodblock waves and the rain falling on the old bridge at dusk. And now the feudal age rests. As you rest, everything that happened, and it is done, and it left behind a world, left behind a particular shape of a country and a culture, and a set of beautiful, difficult ideas about loyalty and impermanence and the proper way to hold a bowl of tea that reached forward through the centuries and is still felt, still present, still alive in the world tonight. Let your breathing slow to almost nothing. Let the darkness be soft. Let the centuries fold back into themselves, like a long scroll being rolled closed, the images passing, the gardens, the swords, the waves, the fire, the quiet room, the bowl of green tea, still steaming, in 2 hands, in the dark. This concludes the video. Thanks for watching. Sleep well. Good night.